Welcome back to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into an incredibly somber and pivotal chapter for Cyprus, specifically looking at the years between 1974 and 1983. We're going to objectively trace the architecture of a frozen conflict. We'll be unpacking exactly how a sharp, incredibly violent fracture across the island essentially hardened into a deeply rooted, decades-long separation. To really grasp this, we have to start with the sheer human scale of the 1974 crisis. Now, think about your own hometown for a second. Imagine the entire population just uprooted overnight. That is the grim reality behind this number right here, 250,000. An estimated 250,000 Cypriots were displaced. They were abruptly relocated by force and circumstance to opposite ends of the island. In what was really just the blink of an eye historically, the entire demographic fabric of the island was completely torn apart. To make sense of it all, today's explainer breaks this complex decade down into 5 phases. We'll cover the demographic rupture, institutionalizing the divide, the economics of separation, the missing and trauma, and finally, what it meant to be a generation apart. All right, Section 1, the demographic rupture, a divided Earth. Look at this data for a second, because it starkly illustrates the massive scale of this population exchange. We're talking about somewhere between 160,000 and 200,000 Greek Cypriots moving from the north down to the south. Meanwhile, 40,000 to 60,000 Turkish Cypriots moved from the south up to the north. This all followed the Turkish military intervention, which Ankara justified under its guarantor status in the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee, a pact that was originally designed to protect the constitutional status of the island. As a result, the Turkish army took control of roughly 37% of the island's territory in the north. The on-the-ground reality of this mass movement meant that people from both communities were forced to leave pretty much everything behind. We're talking centuries of interconnected living just evaporating. People crossed this newly drawn, heavily militarized boundary, which we know as the UN buffer zone or the Green Line, simply to find safety among their own. Property was abandoned, homes were lost entirely. And literally overnight, 2 almost completely ethnically homogenous zones were forged. Moving on to Section 2, institutionalizing the divide, from ceasefire to statehood. This timeline is absolutely crucial because it methodically tracks the bureaucratic entrenchment of this separation. It shows us how a temporary ceasefire essentially calcified into permanent, separate institutions. Right after the August 1974 ceasefire, the Turkish Cypriot administration began formalizing its status. By 1975, they declared the Turkish Federated State of Cyprus. The very next year, the Security Forces Command, or GKK, was established to organize defense. And then, culminating in November 1983, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or TRNC, was formally declared. But here's the catch. While the North was busy solidifying its separate administration, the international community largely rejected the whole thing. The UN Security Council actually passed resolutions explicitly declaring that 1983 TRNC independence unlawful and invalid. So, to this day, the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus operates in the south, while the administration in the north remains recognized only by Turkey. And as you can imagine, that created a massive diplomatic fault line. Let's transition to Section 3, the economics of separation, diverging paths. So that geopolitical divide we just talked about, it rapidly translated into a split-screen economic reality. In the south, the recognized Republic of Cyprus managed to pivot into a high-income, service-oriented economy that was deeply integrated into global markets. But in the north, it was a totally different story. Facing strict international embargoes and blockades, they became incredibly dependent on the Turkish lira, on direct aid from Ankara, and on a massive civil service sector just to keep the economy afloat. And these metrics really drive home that severe economic disparity. The South's per capita GDP grew to be roughly 4 times that of the North, and their total GDP was about 15 times larger. To cope, the Northern economy adapted by leaning heavily on guaranteed civil service jobs, which put a tremendous strain on their resources. So for the average person, this literally meant living on the exact same small island, but experiencing 2 wildly different standards of living. That brings us to Section 4, the missing and trauma, the human cost. Now, beyond all the economics and politics, we have to look at the profound agony of missing persons. As the sources point out, this trauma was deeply gendered and highly visible. For years, wives, sisters, and mothers from both communities bore this agonizing burden. They would stand at the Green Line, holding up photographs, just desperately waiting for any kind of answer about the men who disappeared during the violence and the displacement. And the ripple effects of that kind of loss, they were completely generational. Entire communities on both sides of the divide were raised in the shadow of this trauma. You had an entire generation grappling with the sudden, violent loss of breadwinners, of fathers, of sons. The psychological landscape of the island was forever scarred by the sudden, unexplained absence of so many individuals. Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, A Generation Apart, the Psychological Divide. This survey data is incredibly revealing. When Turkish Cypriots were asked how the events of 1974 affected their individual political relations with Greek Cypriots, the responses skewed heavily to the extreme negative. It clearly proves a severe fracturing of personal friendships that had existed before the divide. And tragically, we see the exact same thing on the other side. When Greek Cypriots were asked that same question, the response was overwhelmingly negative too. It really confirms the mutual devastation of intercommunal bonds across the board. The physical division on the island perfectly mirrored a total collapse in interpersonal trust. But it wasn't just about losing individual friends. Entire communities became fundamentally alienated. When you look at community-wide relations from the Turkish Cypriot perspective, you can see that negative sentiment peaking sharply. The geographic rupture quite literally alienated whole towns from one another. Because the Green Line was completely impenetrable for decades, the sociological outcome was pretty much inevitable. As one observer in our sources notes, young Cypriots were raised in total isolation from each other. Think about that for a second. They were growing up on a very small island, yet they never once interacted with the people living just a few miles away on the other side of that buffer zone. And that absolute physical separation, it fueled some incredibly powerful insular narratives. Without face-to-face contact, it became way too easy for nationalist rhetoric to step in and fill the void. As one respondent painfully recalled, the unseen other was just easily demonized in the minds of the youth. They grew up learning to fear an enemy they had literally never even met. So this brings us to the core tragedy of this era of de facto separation, and I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. When the physical borders of a conflict calcify over decades, they end up building an equally formidable wall in the human psyche. So how does a society unravel decades of psychological separation once a border built on the soil has taken root in the minds of a completely new generation? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And as always, keep questioning what you see.